Hello, I'm Michael Lambert, fellow in social inequalities here at Lancaster University. And today I'm speaking about how colleagues and members of the department research inequalities. So can I begin by asking, who are you?
Hi, Michael. I'm Anne-Marie Fortier. I'm professor of sociology at Lancaster University.
And what is it that you do?
Well, in terms of my research, I could say that the overarching question that's been guiding my research through the years is twofold. How does migration shape and disturb ideas of citizenship, national community, national identity, or local community? So not looking at migration as an exception, but looking at migration as something that shapes the way we understand the world and ourselves as a nation, as a community, but also our citizenship. The other part of that question is what kinds of governing strategies are deployed to stabilize identities in the face of migration. So within that broad research question that's guided my work, there are two things that I've been working on recently: citizenship and migration, so the citizenship attribution process. And I've just completed research about that and published a book about that called Uncertain Citizenship: Life in the Waiting Room. But I've also been working through the years, published several articles around affective citizenship. So citizenship is an element that kind of runs through my current work. And it's linked to migration and how migration destabilizes it, and then the ways in which it's tried, the governance tried to stabilize it. And affective citizenship, which is part of my current research, my book is an element of it, is basically looking at how governments use it as a tool to try to mobilize a form of citizenship, and to try to encourage people to live in more cohesive ways, for example. So affective citizenship becoming the way in which good citizenship can take place, being a good neighbor, loving thy neighbor, for example, and how emotions are used here as a way of distributing or distinguishing between good and bad citizens. And within my research on the citizenship acquisition process, so people seeking to obtain British citizenship in this particular case, it's about one element of it. It's not the only element of it, but where affective politics come in is how affect is integral. There's an affective politic integral to the process, anxiety being the prime one. By definition, applying for citizenship, you'll never know if you'll get it. And anxiety is integral to that process. Even a person who on paper is a shoo-in, they tick all the boxes, they'll be anxious about it. So I'm looking at the unequal distribution of these affects, of how it affects more people than others. But also with citizenship and migration, it's also about the wider European context in which, since the turn of the 21st century, there's been a European-wide, I would say, tightening of rules that limit or make the stakes higher in terms of accessing citizenship, and are raising the requirements for individuals to access citizenship and be awarded citizenship status in the country they've migrated to. So that many scholars have witnessed that since the turn of the 21st century.
I think that's a really clear kind of exposition of saying your research interests are things that kind of drive you, but also how recently that's kind of exposed your areas of interest in terms of the politics of Europe and Britain and kind of concrete examples. But how do you go about researching and understanding this? How do you do what you do?
Yeah. Again, through the years, I've done a range of different things, depending on what the research was about. But where I get most satisfaction, and what I've done for this recent book, is empirical fieldwork, qualitative fieldwork. So ethnographic type of fieldwork. So it's not only interviews, but also observations. It could be participant observation. It could be passive observation, hanging out with people. So, so it's a combination of these different methods that allows me to try to get a sense not only of how people talk about and think about their experience, but how they actually do it. And what I did for this recent research was to work with not only immigrants applying for citizenship, but also a range of different, what I call intermediaries, who are drawn in to the process, conscripted by the state to some extent, to play a role in the process. So language teachers, for example, who suddenly, so ESOL teaches English for speakers of other language, who suddenly find themselves testing migrants in order to be able to give them the certificate that will allow them to apply for citizenship, or local authority registrars who found themselves checking people's application to make sure it's full and complete and ready to send, without any advisory role, but they could. It's like the post office passport checking service. So you could just, I don't know, they stopped doing it in 2018. It might have started again, that I'm not sure, but the last I know, they stopped doing it in 2018. But it was something that was quite lucrative for local authorities, but a new role that they were drawn in. So these were the different actors that I engaged with in my field work. And doing field work, and I've done field work before as well for other research, and what I find is that it really brings things to life. You know, you talk about citizenship, this very abstract concept that we have reams and reams and reams of theories about, and having this kind of lived experience that you could then share and convey back to the reader. It really brings things to life, and I get a lot of, and I learn a lot. I have a lot of time for that kind of work.
I couldn't agree more, and I think not only have you given a really good illustration of how you do it, but the kind of clarity with which you do it is exactly the reason why I set sort of chunks of your book to students, because it brings to light in a very concrete, material way those theoretical things that are much more difficult and sort of harder to grasp, and it makes sense because it's tangible and understandable, but obviously related to those bigger theories at the same time. So it's exceptional. So can I ask, in relation to inequalities, how can you just give an example of how you see or kind of situate your work in relation to this idea of inequalities?
Yes, that's there's so many examples that come to mind, but I suppose the one that I'm particularly interested at the moment, that I want to continue working on, is what I call linguistic imperialism / nationalism. So just to give a bit of background, one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm not the only one, I'm sure, in terms of how citizenship has changed over the past 25 years, for example, is the rise of language as a civic duty, as well as something that will, provide social mobility. So it's become a right in a way, a civic duty and a right, and it's become a requirement. For what the degree to which it's formalized in different citizenship regimes will vary, but it is a requirement. In Britain, for example, people have to do a language test and show their English fluency. So one of the effects of that is that there's this understanding, or this creation of a national language, a national lingua franca, that is totally detached from its history. National languages have emerged in the formation of nations, which means that minority languages will have been discarded and discredited. Generally speaking, that's kind of part of the history of nation formation, is the establishment of a standard national language, standardized language. Another aspect when it comes to languages like English is its imperial history. So English is known as a world language, but the history of that status is rooted in imperialism. So, and colonization, which again is a relationship of power and domination that privileges people speaking some language rather than others. So with regards to citizenship, the unequal distribution of access to the English language from the country from which people come to migrate to England is already something that creates inequalities in terms of them. Some people are illiterate even in their own language. So let alone, in English. Some people speak English, but are not literate. So there's a class, the level of education as well. There's a class issue that's at stake here in terms of not the language test. They could pass a language test, but the citizenship test is of a level that I did it, and there was a section at the time that I did it, it's no longer the same, but when I did it, was a section on European Parliament that I had trouble with, making the distinction between European Commission, European Parliament, to try to learn that for a test. So I could imagine someone who's less educated, less literate, struggling with this kind of test. So there are a range of different class and other inequalities that arise here, but there's also racialized inequalities. So one thing that I'm troubled by is the way in which, and I draw on the work of other people here to think about how, racial linguistics, for example, racial linguists, and how language is racialized, but how people are also languaged by. So race is also languaged, if you want, and people are racialized by language or languaged by race. So, for example, a woman wearing a hijab in a bus somewhere in Wales is speaking another language than English to her child. A man accosts her and aggressively tells her to effing speak English. Another person on the bus turns to him and says, "She's speaking Welsh." So her language was racialized. He was assuming she was speaking another language than a national language, British language, right? Just by the way she looked. Or we could just think about the ways in which even, white-skinned individuals, Europeans, are aggressed in the street for speaking another language. And for me, that's about not being white enough. It is about purification of the linguistic landscape, which is endorsed by government policies and parliamentary leaders of all parties, from all parties, saying you have to speak English to live in Britain, and some of them going as far as saying being British is about speaking English. So when you have that context, it enables individuals on the street to attack others, to expect language fluency. And that is deeply racialized, I think, in terms of the whitening of the nation. And finally, another thing where there's deep inequalities is this this creation of a monolingual public space that discredits and even renders suspicious other languages. But many of the people I met in my research, the migrants, speak more than two languages. The large part of the world is multilingual, but that is totally discredited here, and discrediting multilingualism as well as the multilingual speaker who could be stigmatized and deemed suspect when they speak another language.
A really great example, a way to kind of concretely understand the realities as well as the kind of theories of everyday inequalities in such a very relatable way. I just sort of sat here nodding along, thinking about personal experiences along those lines. But can I finish by asking about your work, and if you work alongside or have worked with any partners, or individuals, stakeholders, or other organisations in relation to research?
At the moment, no, but I have in the past, during my research, I've engaged with the ESOL and language program team from Lancashire County Council, and they had an event with language schools. So they had an event with language schools and the Lancashire program leader, where I was invited to engage with them and talk about inequalities within the system and within the citizenship system in particular, and what it meant for them, the language school providers and teachers, what it meant, the implications for them. So it was really, I wouldn't call it a collaboration, but it was a nice engagement with them. And it's things that I'm hoping to be able to do more in the future.
That's great. And I think, again, showing about perhaps the less immediate ways that research has this kind of relevance, this interest, and this value when thinking about what and how we might do things about inequalities. And then, Marie, can I just finish by saying thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today about your research and its relationship to inequalities.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.